Hey, it's Professor Wham. Um, I realized when I looked back at my past blogs that I had written a blog several years ago back when I first started doing this, called Prisons of Our Own Device, and it was part one. And that is there's no audio of that. That's just a blog, and you can go back in my blogs and find it. And it's essentially my concerns about my student loan and at the time, and what was going to come of that. And it was a very sort of pointed political kind of a blog. But what it was really about was our kind of limited thinking about such things, the kinds of traps that we find ourselves in, uh, including me. And I realized as the last 3 or 4 weeks have unfolded, um, for some reason that blog came back to me, not for obvious political reasons, but because of how much I've changed and how much I feel, and I think a lot of people feel like our situations have changed since then. That was during the pandemic. I think it was towards the beginning of the pandemic. It was like in 21 or 22. I don't really remember. Anyway, what this blog is a series of reflections on paranormal stuff, as well as external political stuff, as well as some historical stuff. It's kind of a state of the union kind of address in a way. And since it's a particularly ridiculous time, I've decided to use, for those of you who are going to watch the video, some particularly silly visuals, especially of chickens, since chickens do occupy my mind a lot these days. This chicken here, for those who don't know, is one of my hens. Her name is Twist. That is a very particular look that she gives when you open the back of the coop and she's wanting food. She just wants to know if you're going to give her something to eat. And that's a very particular posture. She's a very silly bird, as chickens are wont to be. But for some reason, they seem to me at this point to be the only sane creatures that I know in my life are my chickens. So let me just go forth, and we'll go through the several parts of this. So this idea to do this came to me earlier this week when I went to work. I've just been given a new office where I work. It's housed in the building on campus that services primarily school students who have special needs. So there's sometimes a lot of hubbub in this building, and sometimes sometimes it's very quiet. It just depends. But this Monday in particular, and certainly for the last couple weeks, but this Monday in particular, the place was in an uproar. Students were having meltdowns like everywhere. We had a hold in place almost once a day. Lots of screaming, crying, acting out. And as I was walking through the halls on Monday, it just really felt to me like these kids were expressing something else, because there were just so many of them and they were reacting to each other. And I mean, the staff was being very patient with them. And I mean, everything ended up working out okay. But it just really felt intuitively like the kids were expressing their understanding of the turmoil that probably their parents are in, that a lot of people are in. It just really felt like what was coming out of their mouths and in their fits and in some cases, their just refusal to want to do, or what was needed of them to do, is that they were expressing something a kind of a common discomfort, if you will. So, like I said, the staff were patient like always. They followed procedures. Lots of effort is always made to help the students relax. It just really seemed to me like they knew that something was up, that the world, perhaps even their specific world, was changing. So when I wrote part one about 4 years ago, as I mentioned, it expressed my concerns about the student loan forgiveness programs, my fears about another T-Rump pregnancy, presidency, how terrifying. And because I wrote it before the election, I believe. Well, no, yeah, I did. I wrote it actually before the elections. It was during the beginning of the pandemic. What I can say is that my own student loan was forgiven during the interim, and the reason mine was forgiven was that I was in a particular program that was actually approved by Congress. So it was way back in the second Bush presidency. And so it's the only program actually that has not been challenged in court, because it really can't be challenged in court. But this part two concerns stuff that's happened, obviously, in the last month. And many of you know about all these things. And of course, what first brought my attention to these issues was not actually the inauguration itself, but for me, the signal that real change was here was the death of David Lynch, which occurred during the LA fires, the height of the LA fires. He, in fact, was a refugee from those fires. So you can kind of consider him a casualty, if you will, of those fires. And since his birthday, he died right before his birthday was the same day as the inauguration and as Martin Luther King Day. And there just was for me this profound irony. I mean, all through the end of December through the beginning of January, I had been plagued by a series of dreams. And they weren't all bad dreams, by the way. It wasn't like I was constantly engulfed in nightmare. The dreams were about various kinds of fundamental changes in the way that we understand the world, in the way that I understand the world, in the way in which society will reorganize itself. It wasn't all bad, but it was stressful. It was intense. And I remember waking up from several of those dreams and realizing that I really needed to face the emergencies or the changes that we are up against as sort of the next phase, if you will, of changes that began back in 2020 with the pandemic. It's kind of like, it's the same kind of emergency, just a little bit more protracted and in a different realm. So the next thing that activated this sense of urgency in me was, of course, the massive data breach that occurred, or that is still occurring, by the way, when Elania's children compatriots decided to begin plugging external servers into the databases, the servers of the Treasury Department, which, as someone who is in cybersecurity now, who's actually a certified cybersecurity professional and project manager, when I heard what they were doing and how they were doing it, I literally could not sleep an entire weekend and broke out in hives. That is how much it affected me. And what's ironic about it is that as I've worked through that process of finding out more precisely what they've done and trying to explain it to other people, it really began to be clear to me that most people in the United States, unless you are a cybersecurity person or a tech person, you actually don't know what they're doing. And it's really hard to describe it. Just how even regardless of your politics, regardless of whether you think, the federal government needs to be made smaller or not, how egregious this particular procedure that they've used is. So basically, they brought in their own external hard drives. This is just to the Treasury. They plugged into the computer network at the Treasury. That itself is not only a cybersecurity breach, which violates a number of federal laws, but it also violates the federally established procedures at the Department of Homeland Security for cyber security. And it's not clear whether what they were using those servers for. Are they downloading or copying information? Are they trying to load something into the system? It's not clear what they were trying to do with that. But basically what it amounts to, and of course the media doesn't talk about this, but basically what it amounts to is that essentially any individual, company, entity, bank, corporation, or nation that has had any direct dealings, like site-to-site fund transfers with the Treasury Department, should consider their private and privileged information to have been potentially compromised. That means all of you. That means me. I mean, it's not excluding me. It's everyone, basically. Now, how much of this information is secured with encrypted, segmented, or layered layers is unknown. I mean, I have personal experience with federal databases and federal networks, and can tell you that they are extremely layered and segmented, and not just simply for security reasons, but also because of the nature of these institutions. Some of these databases, like at the Treasury Department, have been in existence for 50 years. So they're still basically on, some of the oldest ones are still basically on mainframes and are written in COBOL. So, and the network engineers, generations of network engineers have come in, and they have figured out ways of networking and putting all of these different systems together so that they can work. And for those of you who would say, well, why don't they just update those? Updating that stuff takes a lot of time and a lot of money. And it's a lot cheaper to just simply keep a legacy system for both historic and other reasons, and just to save funding, and link it with newer systems. I mean, it's a little bit clunky, but it can be made to work. In fact, a lot of these older systems are actually more flexible in some ways than some of our newer systems once you hook them up right. But you have to know how to hook them up right. And apparently these kids were not doing that. Apparently these kids were just coming in and they were just trying to literally force new base coding into the privileged administrative console. And that is just not the way to do that kind of stuff. You're going to break the system. So apparently network engineers there were able to convince them when they themselves, and this is based on internal communications that have been filtered through a number of organizations that have sprung up since this has all happened. Whistleblowers and people who are actually on the ground, network engineers who are actually on the ground leaking some of this information out, that they were able, when the kids couldn't actually get in and were going to try to force something, as a result of that, the network engineers actually convinced the one kid who was doing it, to to try his stuff on a subsystem, and they worked with them to let them achieve some access, although it's not clear how much access, some access, but limited so that they wouldn't break the whole system, especially since they were getting ready to do a data migration that had been scheduled for months, in like the next weekend. So right now, because of the restraining orders that the courts have issued against continuing that kind of process, that has granted the network engineers and the employees that are still at the Treasury Department enough leverage that they can push back. But we don't know how much information has been saved. We don't know how much has been copied. We don't know whether or not. We don't know. We do know that certain aspects of the payment system have been affected because already scheduled FEMA payments have been stopped. Already scheduled aid to farmers have been stopped. So there are a number of different types of payments that have been stopped. These payments are obviously connected with other departments. So whether they're being stopped at the departmental level or at the Treasury level is not clear. This is what I mean. See how complicated it is for me to just explain it? This is because most Americans don't understand how these systems work. They don't understand their connection to these subsystems. They don't understand just even what these different systems do with each other. It's just all sort of a blank to them. Now, Elania has shown a willingness to target some aid organizations, which we all know about. Some of this targeting is based on conspiracy theories. Some of it's based on, just sort of random, his random idea of what is parasitical according to his view of things, and some of this information, some privileged information, has been posted on X. But basically, two things have become very clear. One is that with the information at his disposal, Elania could weaponize the funding apparatus of the Treasury in any way he sees fit. Basically at a whim. He's already kind of done some of that. Whenever the whisper of a conspiracy or anything that might piss him off comes his way, he certainly is planning to use this information to enrich himself. Anybody who thinks he's working for anybody but himself, anybody who thinks he's working for Trump has not been listening to him. So, he's not working for Trump, except parenthetically, he's working for himself. And that's all true. Basically, Matthew Garrett, who is a cybersecurity specialist, who has done a lot of work for the Department of Homeland Security, and who works at a very, very high level in the cybersecurity industry, has basically said, after Musk's team breached the U.S. aid computers, random computers were being plugged into federal networks is obviously terrifying in terms of what data they're deliberately accessing. But it's also terrifying because it implies that controls are being disabled. These are cybersecurity controls are being disabled. Unmanaged systems should never have access to this data. And who else has access to this data? Musk is unelected. DOJ has no actual legal authority, at least from a federal law perspective. He's not, in fact, in the last couple weeks, there have been attempts to make him a more official, federal employee. He hasn't been appointed by the president in a formal way. He hasn't been approved by the Senate to have any leadership role in government. These are all things that are necessary for the Department of Government Efficiency to actually operate as an official government office. Executive orders do not create government departments or agencies. And even the executive order uses the quotes, Department of Government Efficiency in quotations. So it's kind of like it sort of knows that this is not legal. Basically, this is a coup. I mean, this has been declared a coup by someone who advises the Department of Homeland Security. So I just leave that with you. This is basically a data breach of the highest magnitude, perhaps one of the largest in history so far. Now, what was interesting were the things that sort of happened in my life after that. When I got home, when I came back to work after all of this started, one of the first things I did was I started going through government. Once I got to work, I started going through government websites. I noticed which ones were down. I noticed which ones were in the process of being edited. For example, I got on the CISA website, and at the time when I got on it at like 8:30 in the morning, and it had like this banner across the bottom that was praising Black History Month with a link, and you went to the link, and the link was a proclamation that was signed by President Trump, saying that Black History Month was a great thing, and proclaiming this month Black History Month. And then at 10 a.m. I went back to the site, and all of that was gone. It was very eerie. So later in that day, I had a meeting with our cybersecurity consultant who helps my agency run K through 12 cybersecurity trainings. And most of the time, we don't talk about politics. Politics are like sort of anathema to talk about in the professional sphere. But we had to, because I was already getting questions. I was already getting phone calls and emails from the districts that I work for about what does this mean in terms of our cybersecurity? What does this mean in terms of the the state laws that we're supposed to follow and that sort of thing? And so we had to have a consult about what we would do, how we would talk to them about this. And I ended up having a meeting later that day with the tech director of one of my districts and one of the techs, or actually both the techs were there. And it was a very interesting conversation because one of those techs, very nice, smart guy, his name is Bobby. He's very dedicated to his job, but he is a diehard Trumpster and a diehard Musker. And while we didn't, talk about the actors, we didn't mention anybody's name. When I was talking about some of the stuff I was beginning to get from the state, and it was clear he was very uncomfortable. And I don't know what his discomfort was. I didn't ask him. I didn't, I didn't, I wanted to say, hey buddy, you're, hey fanboy, your boy Musk is like committing the errors that you're not supposed to commit. What do you think about that? Basically just for people who might be interested, the stance of New York State and our chief privacy officer is that, this is happening, but no laws have changed. Musk is violating HIPAA and probably FERPA, but no laws have changed. So we are going to abide by the laws and by state law. So it's like, if the state has to cut off DC for a while in certain ways, we will. Obviously we're very much connected with DC, at the official level, but our systems are segmented too, and if we have to cut stuff off, we'll cut stuff off. So I have been asked, obviously this is an ongoing story for those of you paying attention. They've gotten into all kinds of systems now. They've started firing people. although all of that is but a drop in the bucket of what the actual deficit is. The actual issue of the deficit is something that has been going on for 40 years. Reagan started it, okay? Reagan started it. I remember this. I lived through it. I watched it happen. I was doing, it wasn't that I wasn't paying attention, but there's very little that, I can do about stuff like that, or anybody can do stuff like that. But a lot of people have been asking me, well, what are the kinds of things I can do to safeguard myself? And there are some things which I'll talk about in a minute, but there are places to get real information. If you're on Facebook or on Blue Sky, there's an organization called a citizens organization of federal workers called the ALT National Park Service, ALT, ALT, like alternative or alternate National Park Service. And they have been acting as a clearinghouse for basically any federal worker who wants to connect with them and provide information. So they've been able to get a lot of times real-time information from federal workers within the system. The federal workforce as a whole has kind of gone on what's called contingency planning or disaster recovery mode, the same kind of mode that they would have gone in if we were under, say, nuclear attack or something. And so there's a system of phone trees and using your own phone and using your own emails, using your own stuff that is encrypted and sort of off of the normal places where people could track you down, and they've been providing information to the Alt National Park Service system. They do have a website. You can find them there. And so they've been updating this information in real time and getting it to the media and getting it to us, the public. And also there's a number of, and they also have a number of other sites that they're connected with. Raw Story has done, which is an independent journalistic site, has done a pretty good job of connecting with federal workers and people within the government to find out sort of like what's really going on. So at this point, it's all really cat and mouse. There's all kinds of issues about whether or not these people are ever going to follow federal law. There does the various judges restraining orders and holds on have empowered employees to resist, basically. What I would recommend for people who are really concerned about their own accounts, there's the obvious gambits of freezing your credit score. The other thing I would do is I would transfer, if any of you use large banking concerns, like Citibank, AmeriCorps, any of those large banking organizations, try switching your accounts to smaller, more regional banks, because if there is a banking crisis that could emerge from this, because that is a real issue, whether we will in the next month or two pay into our national debt, which if we don't, we will default as a nation. We will default, and that will cause a currency crisis, and it will cause a huge economic downturn of, probably within a month or two. So, and this is important because the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. So, if it's sort of taken out of that place, that's disaster for us. I mean, and our banking industry will tank, but the large institutions will tank first. So if you can get into a smaller, more regional banking system, keep your money local. That is always useful. Make sure your passports and all your papers are up to date to the degree possible. If you currently have access to health insurance and/or can afford maintenance on your car, get your checkups, your vaccinations, your oil changes, anything you can afford. Just don't put these things off, because between tariffs, data breaches, natural disasters, which we know will come, and social upheaval, it's really unclear how long availability to these things may last. I do consider this to be a crisis at the level of the pandemic. But unlike the pandemic, this is going to affect everyone, albeit in different ways. The people who are poor or rural or of minority status are going to be impacted first. But we have to take care of our neighbors, so be aware of that. I would also keep a certain amount of cash available in the event that your assets become unavailable due to breaches or collapses or loss of electricity. It is an interesting fact that when society collapses, one of the last things to be abandoned is currency, and that's because people have become accustomed to its measures of valuation. When the Roman Empire collapsed in Western Europe, its coins and denominations, when coins weren't available, continued to be used for centuries until the emergent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms began to develop their own mediums of exchange. And I imagine that our currency, in addition to obvious goods such as water, food, and probably coffee, if you can stockpile coffee, even instant coffee, I've got like 3 years of coffee stockpiled. Seriously, I'm serious. And that's not only for me, it's because I figure other people will need it. I've also learned how to actually roast my own coffee so that you can purchase green beans. What are called green beans. These are unroasted coffee. And as long as green beans are kept in a cool, low humidity environment, they can last for a long time, a number of years, even up to a decade. So if you can stockpile these things, these water, food, and probably coffee, when it can be found, will continue to have some kind of exchange value should every other type of order collapse. Now, as for food, I've always been a extra food person. This is because of how I was raised, living part of my life on a farm. I've always had at least 2 months of food stored for myself, but it just depends on what your space is, what your finances is. How and when stockpiles these kinds of things will vary a great deal depending on where you live, what your income is, and what kind of room you have to store stuff. So the point is assess your situation realistically. Begin to prepare yourself psychologically, emotionally, physically, and if you're so inclined, spiritually. And I do believe that spiritual preparation is extremely important. This is true whether or not you should, whether you decide you should create a bug out bag, for example. It depends. If you live in a place that might also be prone to natural disasters, then that might be a good idea. On the other hand, if you live in a place where there is good community and neighborly support, then it might be a better idea to figure out how to make your home more secure and work with your neighbors to help each other in the event that things get bad. The same holds true about developing a facility with weapons. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not a big fan of the gun. I was raised with guns, so I'm more pragmatic about guns than a lot of people. But I'm not a big fan of them either. Depending on where you are in the country, who your neighbors might be, what you consider your relative tolerance for defending yourself in this manner might be, your background, it might be something to consider. Don't take it lightly, though. Killing someone is not something you can take back. So be aware of that. Be aware of that. It's odd. Not that long ago, we were talking about drones. So I found these chickens on drones, which I was highly amused by, but chickens on drones. Remember one of the first things that Trump did was he gave you an explanation about what these drones were. I don't think anybody believed him. I don't believe him. I mean, only partially, maybe I'm sure some of them were an experiment, but if you pay attention to his explanation, it's not really one. Anyway, so I consider this present situation to be the next stage of a decline. A process which began between 2014 and 2015, and there are reasons why I pick those dates, was accelerated by the 45th presidency, began to manifest in the COVID-19 pandemic, continued in an attenuated and diffuse form through Biden, and is now becoming fully externalized. Both the Democrats and Republicans participated in different ways, And now the tide is beginning to come fully toward the shore. And the foundation for this, for me, was laid back in the 1970s and the 1980s, with the first signal of this being Reagan. So, at some point you can all talk to me about that, but that's my, that's where my trajectory goes when I look back. We've been heading in this way for about 40 years. Now, no conspiracy theory supports what I'm saying. I'm not speaking from conspiracy theory. I'm speaking from both history and my interpretation of history. But I'm also following Algonquin prophetic markers, which have seemed more accurate to me than anything Nostradamus uttered or the various self-proclaimed interpreters of biblical scripture have vomited out lately. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. It's not from conspiracy, but it's from actually looking at history and then looking at certain markers that are enumerated in Algonquin prophetic utterances. Now, the strange thing about all this are the deeper truths that this reveals, all of this reveals. And I'm not talking about QAnon-type conspiracies. And just keep in mind, there's nothing that Americans like better than a good apocalypse. It's just that we're in it now. Like I've mentioned, like many people, I've had the disquieting experience of discovering that many people who I respect and even like that tech I was talking about, have been taken in by the narratives of the deep state promised by QAnon, Alex Jones, and Steve Bannon types. One of these individuals, in fact, is an indigenous elder whose counsel about other things I've always valued. And, I've spoken to her, and she's gone on at length about these things to me. And then when I did some research, I found that almost all of the canard she was giving to me was straight out of QAnon. And I was like, it's out of QAnon. This is not coming from your tradition. This is coming from QAnon, And I haven't bothered to confront her about that, except that I know other people have. But, when it comes to conspiracy theories, no one is completely immune to that special feeling of being in the know that a conspiracy theory provides. The very idea that knowledge is power seems to confirm this. If there are secrets hidden behind doors that keeps one powerless, then it would appear that finding the keys to those doors or even information about those hidden secrets would be concomitantly the source of a power found that was once lost. Now, the problem with conspiracy theories, of course, is that the real power of the conspiracy theory narrative is that it's in the searching itself. Haven't you noticed that all conspiracy theories are endlessly recursive? As one approaches the final destination, one always gets a sense that then what? Then what? Then what? The real sense of power in such narratives is the notion that you know the answer and others don't, rather than an actual solution to some very real problems. The truth in conspiracy theory that holds it all together is that everything and everyone is connected. That is the truth. Everything and everyone is connected. But that's not a secret. That's not a secret. All right? Now, there is a long history of conspiracy theories influencing American politics, going back, excuse me, to the beginning of the Republic. In fact, when you actually look deeply into some of the most famous stories of American origins, the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Boston Tea Party, Paul Revere's Ride, you find that the actual events on the ground were far different and more complicated than the stories that have come down to us, and that many of those actual occurrences were more modest affairs that were then duded up in rumor and marketing in order to make the rebel cause more palatable to the public. During those early years into what the Brits have called, we call it the Revolutionary War, the War of Independence, the Brits call it the Imperial Question. That's how they refer to it. But during those early years, most colonists were actually not keen on breaking with the empire. In fact, at the time when the Declaration of Independence was signed, probably fewer than a third colonists wanted to break with the empire. I mean, the British Empire at the time was the most powerful empire in the world. They had the superior navy. Why would we do that when they were our closest trading partners? And most people considered themselves to be members of to be British, and not to be something else. So most colonists were actually not keen on breaking with the empire, or really didn't care one way or the other. The British Army had to be cast in the most negative way possible in order to get the blood boiling. Now, eventually things did get very nasty, but it was in the second half of the Revolutionary period, during the Southern campaigns, and most Americans are really unaware of those campaigns. And those were brutal. Those did become brutal, and it was based on the impatient brutality of the British Army that began to emerge at that time. That began to turn the tide against the British Empire. But there was something else that was roiling the early American Republic. And this was this notion that the United States was a millennial, messianic nation. And this was actually a very common way of talking in the press about the colonies that were breaking away. There's a book that was written many years ago called Redeemer Nation: The Idea of America's Millennial Role. It's a little tiny book, but it goes back to all of the original sources and looks at that rhetoric. The notion that the United States, the emergent United States, represents a new order, replacing an old order, and that this is part of God's divinely ordained thing. And out of that idea comes the notion of American exceptionalism and the notion of manifest destiny. Both of those ideas can be traced directly to this idea that America is like the promise of heaven on earth, basically, a messianic state. But the early republic was also prone to lots of conspiracy theories. So throughout the early decades of the 19th century, American politics, and you can look at this in the newspapers, were roiled by rumors about Freemasons and Catholics, the power of the First National Bank. A lot of people don't know there was a First National Bank for the first 2.5 decades. And it didn't really have that much power. The Federalists were just trying to regulate currency, which was extremely unstable in the early days of the Republic. There were all kinds of new religious movements that began to germinate and percolate through the colonies and then the states, to say nothing of, by the second decade of the 19th century, the pan-Indian movements that were begun by Neolin and later Tecumseh, as indigenous peoples began to understand the new nature of American colonial expansion. Now, coupled to these conspiracy theories were these millennial concerns. The notion that the United States was a kind of messianic nation. And with all the turmoils and wars and economic flips and flops, as well as a few notable natural disasters, there was this constant rumor that perhaps this was the end of days. This is such a common, it's, for people who are historians of the United States, it's almost tiring, some of this rhetoric that we get, like from the far right and stuff, because this has all happened before. This has all been blathered out at us before in history. It's just that now they're using like social media to do it. As immigrants filtered into the U.S. following the Civil War, conspiracy theories of one kind or another were attached to virtually every population of immigrant. With every Great Depression, and there were 5 of them in the 19th century, and this is because of how unstable and unregulated our currency was, there were rumors about who really controlled the money. So none of what we're hearing is new. Now, there were several presidents who capitalized on these conspiracies and these ideas, including two, Andrew Jackson specifically, and William McKinley, both of whom the present occupant of the Oval Office likes to compare himself. The present occupant seems to forget that neither of them met very good ends. Jackson ended up dying of an infection caused by an old dueling injury, and McKinley was assassinated. Whoops. Now, I've always wondered whether American apocalypticism is actually an internalized reflection of the genocide and brutality on which the larger political order has been based, projected outward to remove the guilt and conscious understanding from the everyday working mind, which has to be protected from such information, the thought that which is the thought that we have to make others non-human in order to survive ourselves. And maybe conspiracy theories are just easier to believe when faced with the complications of actual life, especially when one feels separated from access to power and representation. And yes, here's David holding a picture of his album, Crazy Clown Time, which is kind of how when I'm being ironic, is how I feel about things. I think conspiracy theories are probably easier to believe than how complicated reality really is. Years ago, I learned the differences between networks of power, conspiracies, and conspiracy theories. Those distinctions are often collapsed when one is in a relatively privileged position vis-a-vis some who are defined as others, but then they themselves are often kept from the central nexus of power. So let me explain the difference between networks of power, conspiracies, and conspiracy theories. Networks of power are very simple. Networks of power are simply the communication exchanges that emerge in any group of people where a hierarchy exists. So, and hierarchies exist everywhere. Human beings create them. So it's the tendency of people of similar class and background to communicate with each other. Two parents who are trying to parent a child or children, they have a network of power because they communicate, if they're good parents, they communicate with each other about how to take care of their kids, or how to take care of the finances, or how to take care, you know what I mean? They have a network of power. Parents who get together have a network of power. This is where, people network with each other, whether it's on the level of business or banking, so if you are in a higher socioeconomic bracket, and people who have moved economic brackets will talk about this, people who have started out poor and then they suddenly get rich and they find themselves, punted to the top of celebrityship, and all that kind of stuff. They realize that they have to change the way they live their life, and they have to interact with people differently, and their relationship with money and power changes, and in a society like ours, which is a celebrity-based society, consumption society, people who are at the top of that or have the most money and connect with other people like that, for some reason, we tend to believe that that being at that level necessarily means that they know what the hell is going on, and they may not know what the hell is going on. I personally do not care what the politics of a celebrity are. I do not care because, they will have them, whether they're liberal or conservative or somewhere in between, but they're celebrities. That doesn't mean that they actually know what's going on or have any right. They have a right to express their opinion, but we should not be depending on them for our own political analysis. All right. It's nuts. It's crazy. It doesn't make any sense. But that's what a network of power is. It's whatever level you're at. It's your tendency to connect with people who are at similar levels than you. All right. That's a network of power. Conspiracies, there are conspiracies. All a conspiracy is a desire of people who are connected at a network of power to keep certain things quiet or certain things secret. For example, your parents may not necessarily want to tell you what they do in bed. and you may not want to know. Or if there is, if the family is undergoing some financial difficulty, they may not really share that with you because they don't want to upset you, and you probably wouldn't understand it anyway. All right. These conspiracies can happen for a number of reasons. They can happen for good reasons or nefarious reasons. You know, there were secrets that were kept from the Nazis in World War II, very deliberately. You know, intelligence operatives know this all the time, very deliberately, in order to make sure that the Nazis didn't know that we had broken their Enigma code. I mean, you know, there's the tragic story of Churchill, who had to maintain silence about the fact that the breaking of this Enigma code had told them that the Germans were planning on destroying Coventry, which is a city in England, but they couldn't warn people in Coventry, because if they warned them, then the Germans would know that they'd cracked that code, and they weren't quite ready to let them know that yet because they were still organizing D-Day. And so it's a very famous story. Churchill had to just bite his tongue, and they had to let Coventry be destroyed. It's horrifying, but it was done for a particular reason. I mean, you can agree with that or not, but you know, that's the way conspiracies are. You can have good conspiracies and bad conspiracies. Obviously, criminals are going to be wanting to keep their activities secret, so there are conspiracies of silence. Now, all of this is different than a conspiracy theory. A conspiracy theory, especially the large ones, that sort of conspiracy theories are ways of seeing the world. They are ways of, they're not just simply trying to explain, you know, why governments might do something, or, you know, power exchanges. They're trying to understand why life sucks, or sucks a lot, and why there are people in power, but I'm not one. And conspiracy theories are a way of explaining the totality of things. And what happens if you believe in a conspiracy theory is that you tend to see the entire world as being fundamentally governed by conspiracy, that there's nothing in the world you can trust except, you know, your own little brand of knowledge about what's really going on, all right? Now, what's important to understand here is that marginalized people, you know, black people, people of color, queer people, women in various positions, understand all about conspiracies and networks of power, as they have been at the receiving end of them, usually negatively. So for the most part, interestingly enough, until very recently, such populations have tended not to buy conspiracy theories as such, because they see them for what they are: attempts by individuals in the privileged class to either explain their failure to rise and prevail in that privileged class, or they understand them as justifications for the prejudices those same have adopted or maintain, and whatever outrages they are then committed, they are then permitted to commit. So conspiracy theories, especially American conspiracy theories, especially in the last 30 years, have actually been largely emerging from privileged classes in the United States, namely white male people. And this is just simply true. You can go back, and I challenge any of you who disagree with me to go back and look at the origins of the present conspiracy theories and who tends to consume them. And you will find that what I'm saying is basically true. I mean, there's always exceptions, but exceptions are not the rule. Exceptions are outliers, okay? Now, I'm not the only academic who's noticed that. Modern conspiracy theories have narratives that are very much like many Gnostic myths, which proliferated in the late Roman period. One of the main reasons why the emergent Catholic Church at that time had to stomp out such mythologies early in its history had actually very little to do with theology as such, although that's not what was said, but rather the fact that it's difficult to consolidate political power around a Gnostic story. It is, of course, a narrative that posits all earthly powers of being of deceptive and demonic origin. Now, the deeper truths contained within conspiracy theories are how we are all connected, as I mentioned. And I think that that may be the glue, actually, that holds some of these crazy narratives together and provides their power. Namely, the notion that someone somewhere or someone's somewhere are in control of everything, and if we can figure out who or what, then we might be able to be part of this privileged order. Now, how does this connect to fascism? Well, fascism emerged from a form of progressive nationalism in the late 19th and early 20th century. As a political philosophy, it was really all the vogue among young, dissatisfied intellectuals, especially after World War I. And this was in both Europe and in the United States. And it was seen as both an alternative to communism, and this was the Russian Big C communism, and a solution to the problems of the nation state. In Germany, it was also seen as a potent weapon of revenge. Its power was its ability to embrace a conspiracy narrative as its own in a cult of the nation. It's important to note that communism, and this is Big C communism, had its visionary narrative of history as well. And so, fascism was kind of the counter to that. Both fascism and Big C communism are apocalyptic and in the end authoritarian, even if Marx's original theory hoped for better. Because his original theory hoped basically that his little c communism, and not the difference between Big C communism and little c communism, is that by little c communism, I mean just what Marx wanted, whereas Big C communism are nations or political orders that actually adopted what they claimed was a version of what he wanted. Okay, which no country has ever actually adopted what Marx desired. The dream of Marx's little c communism was his conviction that capitalism would lead humans to a transcendence over tribalism and class struggle. Eventually, humans would realize that they are one species, dependent on each other. Big C communism, as a political ideology, attempts to force-feed everyone into a dependency on a controlling authority, which in its more quote-unquote, successful iterations, for example, Vietnam and China, and I mean by successful, what I mean by that is continuing, they've had some success, actually relies on a relative homogeneity of the dominant tribal or ethnic population. Now, it's worth noting at this point that Lenin, who led the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 in Russia, actually warned his compatriots before he died about Stalin, that Stalin was a narcissist and was crazy and would lead the revolution astray, which he did. Now, I tend to think that Marx was probably more influenced by his Jewish upbringing than he wanted to believe, and tended to think that people are better than they seem to act. The quote-unquote Christianity, and it is Christianity, by the way, or a form of kind of Gnostic Christianity that is behind fascist thinking, distills the essence of Christian election as distinct and perhaps in petulant defiance against the Jewish idea of chosenness into a powerful brew for the collective ego of a state. For fascism is a return to tribalism on a national scale. That's why in its pure form, in the form that Mussolini envisioned or that Hitler envisioned, it actually won't work here, because our society is not homogeneous. Our population is too big. We have too many different kinds of people, and our nation is too large, and we're just completely armed, you know. So the fascists here will have to settle for some kind of oligarchy or kleptocracy with some combo of corporate Christianity attempting to tie it all together. So that's what's being attempted, basically. Now, it's not like everyone is going to die. That would actually be too easy and predictable. The real point is that the changes that we've all heard about and watched in too many movies concerning are really actually here now and in all kinds of ways. So, personally, at this point, I think that almost anything can happen. And, you know, ironically, back in Prisons of Our Own Device, part one of the things I talked about was how terrified I was that I would be imprisoned at some point for some reason for my student loan. And now I still think I could still be imprisoned, actually, but because I know too much, I make people think. But I'm much less scared of that than I used to be, which is ironic. I'm much less scared of it. Since Project 2025 wants to imprison people who produce, purchase, possess, consume, or read any explicit sexual material, it's funny they don't say engage in violent activities. Someone like me is bound to get caught at some point, because I do engage in some of that. That's literally what it says. Go read it. Their definition of obscene is so vague that it can include watching a nature documentary where animals get it on. Now, I'm preparing another blog after this in which I actually talk more specifically about a couple of books, paranormal books, one of which is a Jenny Randall's book it's called Time Storms, and it's about experiences where people have had jumps in time, or where they've lost time or gained time, or the things that are often associated with UFOs but don't necessarily have UFOs present there, in the experience. And I'm also going to be talking about some of the ideas in a book that's called Aliens and Angels or Angels and Aliens by a guy named Keith Tompkins, Tompkins, I think it is. But it will connect to this because a lot of what I have personally been experiencing have been really interesting prophetic dreams. My meditation has gotten a lot more intense. In fact, I've been feeling more and more like I am right where I'm supposed to be. Even though it's also really a really uncomfortable place to be. So, I will have more ideas for you all and insights for you all in an upcoming blog. Because despite its perils, this is also a moment of transition. And in such periods, all kinds of rich, positive things are possible as well. And, honestly, it's not like the American order, which is collapsing, didn't have its own real problems, which made this all possible to begin with. So this is the graphic I'm ending this with. It's, anyone who has chickens, I really think it's amusing when people, use chicken as a pejorative against someone, oh, you're just chicken, because chickens are some of the fiercest little people I've ever known. They are direct descendants of dinosaurs, and there is a fierceness about them. I mean, they know that they are prey, but they are also predators. And when they do predate, there is no doubt about where they came from, So as the days go on, inform yourself, pay attention. Don't think that things are going to be okay. But at the same time, don't assume that the worst will necessarily happen either. I mean, I always keep thinking about best laid plans, and the fact that regardless of whether people are admitting it or not, climate change is real. Pandemics are real. Natural disasters are real. Come on, dudes. You know what I mean? Do you really think you're just going to establish God's good order on earth and it's just all going to be okay? I mean, really? Seriously? Seriously? Okay, then. But don't assume that the worst will automatically happen. Although, obviously, if nuclear weapons are used, all bets are off. I mean, that's sort of like the thing that nobody wants to occur. And of course, eventually things will reach an equilibrium at some point, but don't assume you'll be on the best end of that. Although, don't assume you'll be on the worst end of that either. It's a time that requires maximum flexibility and creativity and the cultivating of relationships that we might not have imagined before. I would also recommend two authors, because I always recommend authors. Read Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, because she describes what we're in as an inflection point. She wrote these two books in the early 1990s. And if you read these books, you'll be like, oh my God. It's proof that science fiction is prophecy, all right? And also, I recommend David Graeber's book, Debt, The First 5,000 Years. The first two are novels. The third is a history of the world as lensed through economic practices, written narratively for lay people who are basically intelligent and want to get a sense of the options that are actually opening themselves up, because there are many opportunities emerging as the old orders self-destruct. And finally, pay attention to your dreams, your intuitions, to those you love and who love you. If you are an artist, do not neglect the creative process. Protect your loved ones. Protect the marginalized among you. This is the time to take the Sermon on the Mount seriously if you are a Christian. Do not abandon the inner life. Do not abandon the inner life. It is what keeps hope and joy alive. And joy is the enemy of despair. Joy is the enemy of fascism. And the one good thing that we have is that we have many, 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 many stories. Many stories of people who have gone through similar kinds of things throughout history. And we have the accounts of how they got through them. So attend to those voices. Attend to them, because they will instruct you. So we will return probably shortly, within a few days, and we'll be talking about passages through time